Lonely widow hasn't touched a man in 10 years, until a cowboy asked to stay at her ranch. 10 winters had passed since anyone crossed the threshold of Maya Freeman's front porch, except the wind. The kind of wind that didn't just howl through trees, but sounded like it remembered things. It remembered laughter, footsteps, music behind closed doors, and it remembered how all of it disappeared when Samuel did. Maya lived tucked deep in the Montana plains, where snow blanketed everything like a forgotten page. Her ranch house stood solitary against the vast sky, shutters weathered, barn doors creaking at every gust. She spoke to no one. No neighbors, no letters, no radio. Her days were built of habits: feed the horse, check the fence, light the stove, count the hours until dusk. She didn't speak, not out loud, not even to herself. Then came the morning when silence didn't feel the same. It wasn't the sound that woke her, it was the absence of it, a stillness that didn't belong. She opened the door, half expecting nothing, and saw the shape of a man collapsed in the snow. His coat was soaked, his skin pale, and blood had begun to bloom beneath him like dark petals on white. For a moment she did nothing, just watched. She hadn't touched a man in 10 years, hadn't let anyone close. Her fingers twitched against the door frame. And then, before she had time to question herself, she stepped out, knelt beside him, and pulled him toward the warmth inside. No words were exchanged. The door closed behind them with a whisper, and for the first time in a decade, Maya's home held something more than wind. It held the beginning. She laid him down with the same care she used for injured colts, calm, practiced, distant. The old cot creaked beneath his weight, the springs remembering someone who used to sleep there, long before the silence moved in. His coat, stiff with frost, clung to his frame like a second skin. She hesitated at first, standing above him as if tending to him might summon something she wasn't ready to feel. But then she knelt, hands trembling slightly, and began to peel away the layers of fabric soaked with melted snow and blood. His skin was mottled with bruises, a jagged gash slicing across his ribs. The cloth in her hand turned pink as she dabbed at it, and though her mind stayed focused on the injury, her body reacted to the warmth beneath her fingertips. That startled her more than the blood. He was alive, human, tangible. And she hadn't felt human warmth in so long it almost burned. He didn't wake, but he flinched at her touch. A quiet twitch of muscle, a ghost of pain. It made her pause. The last time she'd seen a man wince like that was when they tried to pull the bullet out of Samuel. But this was Samuel, and she wasn't the same woman who'd begged the doctor to save him. The fire popped behind her, casting the room in flickering gold. The shadows it threw across his face softened the sharp lines. Dust and fatigue had made him look older, but in the firelight he seemed younger. Like someone who used to laugh. Like someone who'd lost that too. Maya's hands moved automatically, cleaning the wound, checking for broken ribs, finding the old jar of ointment she'd once learned to make from her mother-in-law. The rhythm of care was still in her bones, though she hadn't used it in a decade. It came back now like an instinct buried under grief. She finished and stood, stepping back as if remembering the line she'd promised herself she'd never cross again. No attachments, no visitors, no men, but her fingers betrayed her, still tingling from contact. It was nothing, a wound, a stranger, that's all. She retreated to the chair by the door, not to sleep but to watch. She didn't trust him yet, didn't trust the world enough to let her guard down. But she watched the rise and fall of his chest, the occasional flicker of his eyelids, the muscles in his jaw twitching even in sleep. And with every hour that passed, something within her shifted, not loudly, not quickly, but like a mountain finally giving in to thaw. The wind pressed against the windows, but she no longer listened. Her attention was tethered to that narrow cot, to the stranger who didn't belong here, and yet somehow did. In the stillness of that long night, Maya remembered what it felt like to care if someone lived or died. And that terrified her more than the sound of wolves or the creak of footsteps. The morning light crawled in slow, reluctant lines across the wooden floorboards. Maya didn't light the stove. The coffee had cooled hours ago, left forgotten on the table beside her. She hadn't moved much, only shifted her gaze from the man still breathing quietly on the cot to the drawer she never touched. It had been 10 years since Samuel died. Not in war, not in sickness, just vanished from her world. They said it was an accident. They said wolves. But in a place like this, people said things to make silence feel less cruel. Maya remembered that morning too well to believe in clean explanations. He left to check the northern fence and never came back. What they found of him didn't explain what she lost. For the first few weeks people came. They brought food, spoke in hushed voices, filled the house with a warmth that grated against her grief. Then they stopped coming, and the silence took hold. She stood now, the boards creaking under her boots, and walked to the writing desk near the window. Her fingers hovered over the handle. That drawer hadn't been opened since the third snowfall after he died. She told herself there was no reason to go back. But the man on the cot, his breath, his presence, had stirred something, a pulse beneath the dust. She opened it. The paper inside was folded once carefully, as if even the act of folding had required thought. A single name was written on the outside in her own hand. Clara, her sister, who had sent one letter a year after the funeral, asking Maya to come east. She hadn't replied, but she had written, once. "Dear Clara," the letter began, "I don't know how to start, so I'll just tell you. Samuel is gone. I keep walking through the house expecting to find him in the next room. His coat still hangs by the door. I haven't touched it. I can't." She'd written that part sitting right here, staring at that very coat. It's still there, still untouched. She had written about selling the land, about maybe boarding a train, starting somewhere new. "But then I go outside," the letter continued, "and the wind carries his voice. The fence line still has his boots in the mud, and I think, if I leave, he won't know where to find me." She never sent it, never folded the corner for a stamp, never sealed the envelope. She just left it there as if someday she'd finish it. But she never added another word. Maya read the letter twice, slowly, then folded it again with the same care. Her hands didn't shake. They learned not to. She didn't cry either. There was a time long ago when grief was loud, ripping through her chest like thunder. But over the years it settled into something quieter, denser, like wet soil around buried roots. She placed the letter back into the drawer and closed it gently. It didn't creak this time. Maybe it too had grown used to being left alone. She turned back toward the cot. Arthur, she still didn't know his name, but in her mind it was forming, shifted in his sleep. A small sound. The kind that wouldn't have meant anything 10 years ago, but now it tugged at something she didn't realize was still attached. She sat down again, not because she needed to, but because it felt wrong to walk away. Not yet. 10 winters without speaking Samuel's name. 10 winters without feeling the warmth of another soul in her home. And now here lay a stranger, stitched into the fabric of her quiet world like a thread that didn't match, but held. She hadn't asked for this, but maybe, deep down, she'd been waiting, not for someone to save her, just for something to break the silence that had wrapped around her heart like snow that never melted. And now, in the hush of that long morning, Maya realized, sometimes it's not the storms that change you. It's the third day he opened his eyes. Maya was standing by the window, watching the wind shift snow across the pasture. She heard it before she saw it, a faint intake of breath that didn't belong to her. When she turned, he was blinking slowly as if trying to piece together where he was, what year it might be. He didn't speak, just stared. Not with fear, not with confusion. With the weary clarity of someone who had woken up too many times in unfamiliar places. She moved slowly, out of habit more than caution. Poured water into a tin cup, held it out. His hand was unsteady, but he took it. Drank in slow sips, then nodded barely. That was their first conversation. Later that afternoon, she walked out to feed the horses. The snow had let up, but the sky still held its breath in gray silence. As she tossed hay into the trough, she heard footsteps crunching behind her. She turned to see him there, wrapped in the blanket she'd given him, boots still muddy, eyes scanning the horizon like someone who knew how to read landscapes the way others read faces. The horses tensed, they didn't know him. One kicked the post, another snorted ready to bolt. Then he spoke low, rhythmic, not in English, Lakota maybe. The words came like a lullaby carved from river stone, soft, grounded. The horses stilled. Maya watched in stunned silence, not because of the language but because of what it did, how it calmed them, how it reached something beneath the skin. She hadn't seen a man speak like that in years, not with power, with reverence. He turned to her, nodded again. Still no name, no questions, just acknowledgement, as if to say, I won't ask about your ghosts if you don't ask about mine. They walked back to the house together in silence, not the awkward kind. The kind that says enough has been spoken without words. Inside, as she stirred soup over the fire, he sat by the hearth, warming his hands. That's when she said it. You're safe. 3 words. But for her it was more than reassurance, it was a vow. A permission she hadn't granted anyone in 10 years. She didn't just mean he was safe here. She meant, I will not shut the door again. Not yet. He looked up at her, eyes soft, tired, then nodded once more. She turned back to the stove, but something in her posture had changed, just slightly. A tilt of the shoulder, a deeper breath. Outside, the snow didn't stop. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a quiet place where voices could begin again. It was just past dawn when Arthur stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed against the wind. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a thin crust that cracked underfoot. The sky was a dull slate, promising more storms to come. He scanned the horizon like someone used to reading more than just weather in the land. His eyes fell on something that didn't fit, the pattern of boot prints, circling the corral, too fresh to be his or Maya's. They hadn't been there the day before. He knelt beside them, brushing away frost. The impressions were deep, deliberate, paced like someone walking slow, watching. He followed the trail to the edge of the tree line where it vanished. Whoever it was had come close, too close, and left no mark of approach or retreat, just orbiting like a predator studying a cage. Back inside, Maya was by the stove, ladling porridge into mismatched bowls. Arthur walked in without speaking, set his gloves down on the table. She looked up, sensing something in his shoulders. "Someone's been out by the corral," he said simply. She didn't flinch, just paused, spoon midair. Then, "They come sometimes. Been coming for years." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "You ever tell anyone?" She shook her head. "No one to tell." He sat down across from her. "They leave anything. Letters, offers, promises of money, I burn them." He waited. She didn't elaborate, but her hands, steady on the spoon, were gripped tighter than before. Arthur leaned back. "What do they want?" She met his gaze steady. "The creek." And there it was. He knew this story. Had lived it before in other places with different names. Places where water wasn't just life, it was currency. Power. He'd worked for men who would drain a family dry just to control a stream. "How long?" he asked. "Since the second winter after Samuel died," she said. "They thought I'd break." Arthur looked out the window. The land stretched for miles, frost-covered and silent. But now he saw it different, not just a home, a prize. One they assumed a widow couldn't hold. "They think you're alone," he said. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He stood and moved toward the door. "I'll check the perimeter." "Arthur," she said quietly. He turned. Her voice was flat, almost casual. "I stopped being scared a long time ago. That's not the same as being safe." He nodded, then stepped outside. But her words stayed with him, humming beneath his breath like a warning. The wind picked up, rattling the eaves, and in it, he could almost hear footsteps that no longer left. That night the fire burned low. Wind whispered against the windows like a voice trying to get in. Maya sat near the hearth, darning a worn sleeve that didn't belong to her. Arthur stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes on the shadows stretching across the floorboards. He hadn't said much all day, not after the footprints, not after she told him about the letters, the offers, the pressure. But now, in the silence between wind and flame, he spoke. "There was a man once," he said, voice flat, "hired me to make problems disappear. Morrison." Maya looked up, needle still in hand. The name hung in the room like smoke. "I worked for him when I was young," Arthur continued. "Rode with his men, thought I was doing something smart. He'd detail us which rancher was holding back progress, which homestead had water worth more than land, and we'd ride in. Make it clear they had two choices, sell or disappear." He wasn't looking at her, just the floor. "There was this one place," he said. "Family of 6, nothing special, just a cabin, a spring, a stretch of quiet. Morrison wanted it. Said they were squatting, said they were slowing down irrigation deals. So we went in, burned the barn, shot at the ground, broke windows. He paused. I told myself I never aimed at them, that I left before the real damage was done. But that's a lie. I stayed, I watched. Maya didn't speak. Her hands moved again, slowly threading the needle, but her eyes didn't leave him. I left after that, Arthur said. Thought I could walk away. Tried to do good things after, ranch work, train repairs, freight runs, but it never washed out. The smoke stayed on me, like it got into the seams. Outside, a tree branch snapped under frost. Neither of them flinched. And now you're here, Maya said softly, not a question. Arthur nodded. Didn't plan it, was heading north, got jumped. Wound up bleeding on your porch. Maya looked at him for a long time, eyes steady. She didn't ask why he was telling her. She didn't accuse him, didn't forgive him either, just sat with the weight of it. I used to think, she said slowly, that Samuel died because he went out alone. Maybe it was wolves, maybe just bad luck. But after that, the letters started. Men riding past the fence. People asking if I needed help managing the place. Her voice was calm, too calm. You think Morrison had something to do with it, Arthur said. I think, Maya replied, that Morrison never liked unanswered questions, and Samuel asked a lot of them. Silence again. Arthur stepped forward, close enough to see the thread in her hand tremble just slightly. I didn't know him, Arthur said, but I know the type of man who dies for asking the right thing at the wrong time. Maya looked down. So do I. She stood, folded the fabric neatly, and placed it on the table. Then turned to face him fully. Do you still work for him? No, Arthur said. And if he sees me now, he'll want me gone as much as you. Maya nodded once, slowly. Then we have something in common. It wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement. A line drawn in the ash between past and present. And as Arthur sat down across from her, hands open, unarmed, Maya saw not the man who had once ridden with fire, but the one trying to hold back its spread. For now, that was enough. Outside, the creek ran beneath layers of ice, still whispering secrets no one wanted to hear. It was nearly midnight when Maya lit the lantern and motioned Arthur to follow. No words, just a glance over her shoulder, steady and unreadable. He rose from the chair, boots barely scuffing the floor, and trailed her through the narrow hallway toward the back pantry. She moved aside a sack of flour, then pressed her hand flat against the wall. A soft creak, the kind that came from long-held secrets, and a hidden panel slid open. Behind it, a staircase curved downward, swallowed by darkness. Arthur hesitated, not from fear, but from surprise. Then he followed. The air beneath the house was colder, still with the scent of soil and metal. Maya set the lantern on a hook, its glow revealing more than Arthur expected. Shelves lined with ammunition, crates of dried food, bundles of maps, hand-drawn and marked with symbols. There were rifles, old but clean, a ledger, a journal, a set of blueprints detailing the layout of the ranch from every angle. This, she said, voice low but unwavering, is what I built while the world thought I was grieving. Arthur walked slowly past the table. On one map, red X's marked fence posts, wells, nearby ridges. Another charted wind direction by season, range of visibility from different elevations. He leaned closer. "These are battle plans," he said, not asking. Maya nodded. "I didn't plan on surviving by accident." He looked at her, truly looked. In the flickering light, she didn't look hardened, just prepared. Her quiet had never been passive. It had been planning, waiting. "Why show me this now?" he asked. "Because the man at my table needed a place to heal," she said. "But the one who saw the footprints by the corral, he needs to know what I am." Arthur took a long breath. "I thought you were alone out here, vulnerable." "You thought wrong," she said. "They took my husband, they won't take my land." He didn't respond immediately, just ran his fingers over the lines on the map, feeling the intention in every stroke. She had done this alone. While others pitied her, while Morrison circled like a buzzard, Maya Freeman had turned her grief into a fortress. "You're not waiting for rescue," he said quietly. "I never was." The knock came at noon. 3 sharp raps on the front door. Measured, confident. Maya froze mid-step, a jar of preserves still in her hands. She hadn't heard a wagon, no horse hooves, just those 3 knocks, like punctuation after a threat left unspoken. Arthur rose slowly from the table, rifle already leaning against his chair. He moved to the window, peeled back the curtain just enough to see. 2 men stood on the porch. One tall, lean, wrapped in a coat too fine for winter work. The other broader, silent, holding a revolver not exactly hidden. Maya set the jar down. "Morrison." Arthur's jaw clenched. "I'll answer," she said, moving toward the door. He stepped in front of her. "No, let me." She hesitated, then nodded. When the door opened, the cold came in first, then the smile. "Well, I'll be," Morrison drawled. "Arthur Callahan, still breathing. I was starting to think you'd vanished for good." Arthur didn't return the smile. "You always did assume too much." Morrison's eyes flicked past him, catching a glimpse of Maya in the shadows. "Ah, and this must be the lady of the house. Pleasure, ma'am. I come bearing peace." Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. Morrison reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a folded document. "Offer gone up," he said. "We know you've got good water flow here. There's value. My employer's willing to be generous." Arthur didn't even look at the paper. "You don't have employers, Morrison. You have leeches in suits." Morrison chuckled. "Now that's not fair. I'm trying to save this fine woman from a long winter with too many enemies and not enough hands." "You bring your own enemies," Maya said from behind Arthur. Morrison turned back toward her. "Ma'am, I assure you, I come with no intention of harm. Think of this as a white flag." Arthur stepped forward. "Then why the gunman?" Morrison glanced at his companion, who gave nothing away. "For protection, naturally. These are uncertain times." The wind picked up, tugging at Morrison's coat like fingers trying to peel him back to wherever he came from. "This land isn't for sale," Maya said. "Everything's for sale," Morrison replied smoothly. "Eventually." "No," Arthur said. "Some things are just waiting for the right fight." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "That a declaration?" Arthur met his gaze. "That's a fact." The tension coiled in the space between them. It wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, but it was thick enough to taste like dust before the first shot. Morrison folded the paper, tucked it back into his coat. "Well, I tried." He tipped his hat. "We'll be seeing each other again, I reckon." "No," Maya said quietly, "you won't." He paused at that. For the first time, something in his smile faltered. Then he turned, stepped down the porch, and vanished into the wind. Arthur closed the door, locking it behind him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Maya spoke. "He's testing us." Arthur nodded. "And planning." She looked out the window at the empty yard. "So are we." Outside, the snow swirled. Not violently, but with purpose, as if the land itself was readying for something it had long awaited. The morning after Morrison's visit, Maya rose before the sun. She moved through the house in silence, lit only by the faint gray of dawn. Her steps didn't echo. They landed soft, deliberate, like someone walking toward something long overdue. Arthur was still asleep on the cot by the fire, breath steady, hand resting near the rifle that never strayed far. He stirred slightly as she passed but didn't wake. In the back of the closet, beneath old quilts and forgotten coats, hung a dress she hadn't touched in years. Black wool, high collar, buttons like beads of mourning. The one she wore at Samuel's burial. The one she couldn't bring herself to throw away. She slipped it on. The fabric had faded, the fit looser now. But it held. It still held. When Arthur emerged into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he stopped short. She was standing by the stove, black against the morning light, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the faint scar along her wrist, from fencing, not grief. He stared at her for a moment, then said, almost carefully, "You're wearing morning clothes." She didn't turn. "Yes." "For him." "No," she said, then turned, met his eyes. "For what I'm about to bury." Arthur stepped forward, voice lower. "And what's that?" She answered without blinking. "The illusion that I'm still waiting." The silence between them settled like dust on a grave. Then Arthur nodded slowly. They sat at the table. No breakfast, just maps, plans. Rereading the letters Morrison had sent over the years, what few she had kept. Arthur took notes, redrew the surrounding terrain, marked possible approach points. He spoke little. Maya spoke less. But their movements matched. Their pauses aligned. There was no longer a guest and a host, just two people preparing for a storm that had already begun. Later that afternoon, as the sun cast long lines across the snow, Arthur handed her a loaded rifle. She took it without ceremony, checked the sights, and set it beside the door. He watched her as she moved, precise, unfazed. There was no fear in her eyes, only a kind of solemn fire. "You could still leave," she said at one point, not as a challenge, not as a plea, just a truth laid bare. "So could you," he replied. She didn't smile, but something in her posture softened. That night they stood on the porch together, shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the land. Arthur glanced at her dress again. "You sure about that color?" Maya tilted her head. "If I'm going to die," she said, "I want to look proper." It wasn't bravado, it wasn't drama, it was legacy. They met at the edge of the pasture, where snow met dirt, where tracks vanished into wind. The sky was pale, the kind that came before storms. Morrison arrived with 5 men, all armed but standing back. He knew better than to swarm. Not here, not with Maya standing at the porch like a judge made of iron and ash. He stepped forward, voice slick. One fight, one man each. Settle this clean, no need for messy resistance. Arthur stood beside Maya, calm as the sky, but his fists curled like coiled rope. He looked past Morrison to Pike, a mountain of a man, former soldier, former killer, eyes like a pit that never gave back light. Maya said nothing, just reached into her coat and handed Arthur a knife. Not a rifle, not a pistol, a blade. Arthur took it. Morrison's grin didn't quite reach his eyes. Still favoring the classics, I see. Arthur stepped forward. You always did prefer blood when someone else cleaned it up. The two men circled, the others moved back. Maya didn't blink. The fight started without warning. Pike lunged fast, faster than a man his size should. Arthur ducked, sliced wide, missed. Pike's fist caught his ribs, air gone in a flash. He stumbled, recovered, eyes never leaving Pike's shoulders. That's where intent lives. They danced in dirt, in silence. No gunfire, no crowd. Just wind and footfalls and the wet sound of blade meeting flesh. Arthur bled first arm, then Pike thigh, but Pike didn't slow. He grinned, teeth red. You always were the soft one, he spat. Arthur didn't answer, just waited. Let Pike come again. And when he did, Arthur shifted, not back but in. Let the punch graze him, drove the blade under Pike's ribs, not clean, not instant, but final. Pike staggered, fell. One breath, then none. Morrison took a step forward, then stopped. Arthur stood over the body, breathing hard, knife still dripping. Behind him, Maya remained still. But her eyes held something ancient, something that dared Morrison to make another offer. He didn't. Consider this an unfortunate loss, he muttered. We'll be in touch. Arthur turned, knife still in hand. You won't. Morrison hesitated, then turned, walked. His men followed, eyes low. Arthur dropped the blade. Blood soaked his sleeve, dripping into the snow. Maya stepped down from the porch, wrapped his hand in a cloth without a word. He looked at her, breath ragged. He would have killed me. She tied the cloth tighter, but he didn't. He studied her face. You watched. I always watch, she said, and I knew you'd stand. He didn't answer, but inside something quiet shifted, not pride, not relief. 3 days later, Pike returned, but not as an enemy. His arm was bound, shoulder torn from the duel, but he rode slow, unarmed and alone. Maya saw him first, standing by the barn with a lantern. Arthur stepped outside without his rifle, not out of trust, but because something in Pike's posture didn't carry threat. It carried fatigue. He dismounted, groaned as he hit the ground, then reached into his coat and pulled out a leather-bound folio. Thick, weathered, the kind of thing men like Morrison didn't leave lying around. He handed it to Arthur without ceremony. You'll want this. Arthur opened the cover. Maps, letters, names, payment records, schedules, every lie Morrison told. Every deed signed under threat. Every man bought and later betrayed. Pike's voice was flat. He turned on us too, promised more than he had, started leaving men out to dry when things got tight. Some of the boys didn't take kindly to that. Arthur looked up. He's dead. Pike nodded. Last night, not by me. Maya joined them in the snow, coat pulled tight. And now what? Pike looked at her, really looked. not as a woman alone on a ranch, but as someone who had never been alone at all. "Now," he said, "you do whatever you were going to do anyway. You don't owe him your fear anymore." He didn't stay long, didn't need to. Rode off into the pale morning like someone who'd finally chosen the quiet over the noise. Maya and Arthur stood in the yard as the sun rose behind the trees. No celebration, no speeches, just a stillness that felt strange after so much noise. No bullets had ended Morrison. No fire, just doubt, just betrayal. The kind of collapse that happens not with a bang but with silence. And maybe, Maya thought, that's how evil ends sometimes. Not with a righteous fight but with the slow rot of its own lies. She looked at Arthur. He looked at her. No victory in their eyes, just the relief of survival. 6 months later, the Freeman Ranch didn't echo anymore. The wind still moved through the trees, but now it carried voices. Children laughing near the creek, boots crunching through garden rows, someone tuning an old guitar on the porch. Life had returned, not all at once, but gently, like grass pushing through frost. Maya sat at the old desk by the window, the one she hadn't touched since Samuel. Her pen moved slow, careful. "Clara, if you still have that room in your heart for lost things, this place might be calling for you too. We have room, and more growing every day." She folded the letter, sealed it. This time she placed a stamp in the corner. This time she walked it to the gate herself. Arthur was by the fence, mending wire. He looked up as she passed, hands still strong despite the healing scar along his forearm. She stopped beside him, close enough to smell pine and sweat and the warmth that had somehow become home. He reached for her hand, and for the first time in 10 years, she let it stay, not because she was no longer afraid, but because the fear had been replaced by something stronger, trust. It had taken loss, silence, fire, and thaw, but in the end it wasn't the fight that saved them. It was the choice